Disowned by my family of doctors, I met them again 9 years later at my sister's wedding. The grip on my wrist was hard enough to bruise. I remember the exact pressure of my mother's fingers, the way her wedding ring dug into my skin as she pulled me into the coat closet at my sister's reception, away from 300 wedding guests and 11 doctors from 4 different hospitals. "You are going to smile," she whispered, her breath hot against my ear. "And you are going to leave before dessert and nobody is going to know who you really are." I looked down at her hand on my wrist. Then I looked up and smiled. "Okay, Mom," I said. "But you should know, I already told them." Her face went the color of the tablecloth behind her. "My name is Michael Ferris. I'm 34 years old and 9 years ago, my family disowned me in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. I come from 4 generations of physicians. My father, Dr. Richard Ferris, is a cardiothoracic surgeon with 31 years at Boston Memorial. My mother, Dr. Elaine Ferris, ran the hospital's internal medicine department for 2 decades. My older brother, Dr. Thomas Ferris, followed my father into cardiology. My younger sister, Dr. Priya Ferris-Shah, the bride at the wedding I just described, finished her residency in oncology 4 years ago. And me? At 25, I dropped out of my 3rd year of medical school to start a company. Not just any company. A medical logistics software platform that helped rural hospitals manage supply chains during shortages. I named it Ferris Health Systems, which in hindsight was either an act of defiance or an act of hope. Probably both. My family called it quitting. My father told me, in front of my grandfather's portrait in our living room, that I was throwing away 4 generations of legacy to sell an app. My mother didn't speak to me for 6 months. Then at a Thanksgiving dinner in front of extended family, my father stood up and said, "As of tonight, Michael is not welcome in this house, and he is not to use the Ferris name in connection with any of our practices." That was 9 years ago. I was 25. I had $40,000 in student loan debt, $12,000 in savings, and a business plan that 3 banks had already rejected. Today, Ferris Health Systems processes supply logistics for 214 hospitals across 19 states. Last year, our revenue was $47 million. I own 68% of the company outright. My family doesn't know any of that. As far as they're concerned, I'm still the son who threw it all away. I let them believe it. I had my reasons, and by the end of this story you'll understand exactly why. This is the story of what happened when I walked back into their world at my sister's wedding 9 years later, and what I found waiting for me there was so much worse than I ever imagined. I almost didn't go to the wedding. Priya sent the invitation to my old apartment, forwarded twice before it reached me. A cream envelope with gold foil lettering. "Dr. and Mrs. Richard Ferris request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter." My name wasn't on the RSVP card. Someone had handwritten Michael +1 in the corner, in Priya's looping cursive, like an afterthought stapled onto her parents' formal invitation. I told myself I was going for her. That part was true. I arrived at the Larchmont Country Club at 5:40 p.m., in a navy suit I'd bought off the rack that morning because everything in my closet felt too expensive to wear around my family. I didn't want questions. I found my assigned seat. Table 14 in the back near the kitchen doors beside 2 cousins I barely recognized. My parents sat at the head table, my father in a tuxedo with a boutonniere the size of a fist, holding court with 3 of his surgical colleagues. I watched him raise a glass of scotch and say, loud enough for our whole side of the room to hear, "To family. To the ones who make us proud, and the ones who remind us why standards matter." Everyone laughed. My mother's eyes flicked to my table and held there for exactly 2 seconds before she looked away. That was it. That was the whole betrayal in miniature. A toast at his own daughter's wedding, used as a scalpel to cut me open in front of 200 people, and not one person at that head table so much as blinked. I sat there in my off-the-rack suit, holding a glass of water because I didn't trust myself with anything stronger, and I smiled. I'd learned a long time ago that my family only respected 2 things: money and the appearance of control. I had plenty of the first. I was about to manufacture a lot of the second. Beat 1. The seating chart. During cocktail hour, I slipped away to the club's business center to check email. An old habit impossible to break. And I overheard my brother Thomas through a half-open door, talking to the wedding planner. "Just keep him in the back," Thomas said. "Dad doesn't want him near the photos. If anyone asks, say there wasn't room." I stood in the hallway with my phone in my hand, recording nothing, just listening, feeling something cold settle in my chest. Not surprise. Confirmation. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I went back to table 14 and ate my chicken. Beat 2. The foundation. 2 days after the wedding, I did what I always do when something doesn't sit right. I looked at the paperwork. It's a habit from building a company. If you want the truth, follow the filings. I searched the Massachusetts Secretary of the Commonwealth's database for Ferris Family Foundation, a charity I remembered my parents launching 6 years earlier, ostensibly to fund scholarships for first-generation medical students. I donated $15,000 to it myself years ago, before the falling out, back when I still believed in the idea of us. The foundation's most recent Form 990 showed total scholarship disbursement over the last 3 years. $9,200. Total administrative and operational expenses. $612,000. Board members. My father, my mother, my brother Thomas, and my father's golf partner, a man named Craig Doyle, listed as executive director, with a salary of $180,000 a year. I called my accountant, a sharp woman named Renata who'd audited 3 of my hospital contracts. She pulled the filings, cross-referenced them, and called me back within the hour. "Michael," she said, "this isn't a charity. This is a laundromat." Beat 3. The confrontation. I called my father directly, the first time in 9 years. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear ice clinking in a glass behind his voice. "Michael, to what do I owe this?" "I looked at the Ferris Foundation's 990s, I said. "I want to understand the administrative costs." There was a pause, then a laugh, warm and condescending, the laugh he used on medical students who asked obvious questions. "You wouldn't understand it," he said. "Nonprofit compliance overhead is enormously complex. Conference costs, donor cultivation events, professional liability coverage for the board. Craig runs a tight operation. If you spent 5 minutes in a real institution instead of your little software company, you'd know these things aren't as simple as a spreadsheet." I said, "That makes sense. Thanks for explaining." I hung up, and I let him believe I'd swallowed it whole. Beat 4. The mockery. 3 nights later, my cousin Denise, who'd sat next to me at table 14 and, unlike the rest of them, had always been kind to me, sent me a video. She'd recorded it by accident, her phone propped against a wine bottle at a family dinner I hadn't been invited to, the audio picking up my parents' voices from the next room. My mother's voice, muffled, amused. "Do you think he actually believed that nonsense about donor cultivation events?" My father's laugh. "Michael believes what he's told, Elaine. He always has. That boy sold his medical degree for a laptop. He doesn't have the mind for this." Thomas chiming in. "As long as he doesn't ask about the Cayman transfer, we're fine." I sat in my kitchen at 11 p.m., replaying that 4-second clip, the Cayman transfer, 6 times. Beat 5. The deeper rot. That single phrase sent me down a hole for the next 11 days. I hired a forensic accountant, a man named Victor Alba who specialized in nonprofit fraud, and gave him everything: the 990s, the foundation's bank disclosures, property records. What he found wasn't overhead. It was a shell structure. The Ferris Family Foundation had been loaning money to a shell entity called Meridian Health Consulting, registered in the Cayman Islands, which then paid consulting fees back to my father, my mother, and Craig Doyle personally. Nearly $2.1 million funneled out of a charity meant to fund scholarships for kids who looked exactly like I used to, standing in a hospital hallway wondering if medicine was even for me. My father hadn't just disowned his son for building a business. He'd built a fake charity, named it after our family, and used it to steal from the exact kind of student he'd once told me I was betraying by leaving medicine. I made a decision that night, sitting at my kitchen table with Victor's report open in front of me. I was not going to come at my family with facts and fury. I was going to come at them the way water comes at stone, slow, patient, unthreatening, until they stopped bracing for me entirely. I called my mother the following week and asked, in a smaller voice than my own, if we could have coffee. I told her I'd been doing some thinking since the wedding, and that I missed the family, and didn't understand half of what people had been saying about the foundation. I let that hang vague and confused, like a man grasping at rumors he didn't have the sophistication to parse. I wore an old cardigan to that coffee, the kind of thing that made me look 10 years older and considerably less successful. I let my shoulders round. I stirred my coffee too long, the way people do when they're nervous. I asked her hesitantly, "Is it true Dad's foundation is in some kind of trouble?" People online were saying things. My mother's whole posture changed. She reached across the table and patted my hand, the same hand she'd gripped hard enough to bruise in that coat closet. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "You don't need to worry about grown-up business. Just enjoy your little company." I smiled and let her believe I was exactly that small. Inside, I was doing the math on subpoenas. The tactic was simple. Every predator relaxes around something it's already decided is harmless. I needed my family relaxed. I needed Craig Doyle relaxed. I needed them talking freely, carelessly, in front of me the way people talk in front of furniture. I set the bait 3 weeks later. I told my father I wanted to make things right, and offered a $250,000 donation to the Ferris Family Foundation. A peace offering, I said, a chance to be part of the family's legacy again. I insisted on one condition, framed as sentimental rather than suspicious. I wanted to attend the board meeting where the donation was formally accepted, just to feel like part of something, I said, my voice cracking slightly on cue. My father agreed instantly. Of course he did. $250,000 was, to him, proof that I'd finally learned my place. What he didn't know was that the check I wired came from an escrow account tied to a services agreement Victor Alba had drafted. One that gave my legal team standing to audit fund usage for 90 days. What he also didn't know was that I'd asked Denise, the only cousin who still spoke to me honestly, to wear a small recording pin the foundation's own bylaws required for board meeting minutes. Perfectly legal, since Massachusetts allows one-party consent recording, and Denise, as a newly appointed junior board member, a seat I'd quietly arranged for her through a mutual connection, had every right to record proceedings for her own notes. The night before the meeting, I sat in my apartment with my phone on the kitchen table, watching a live audio feed from Denise's pin, testing the signal. Every few minutes it buzzed faintly under my palm, a heartbeat I didn't control. I texted Victor. "Ready tomorrow?" He texted back. "Ready. Do you have your evidence packet printed?" I looked at the folder on my desk, 60 pages, tabbed, highlighted, notarized. On the cover, I'd printed a single line, the phrase that had started all of this, the Cayman transfer. The board meeting was held in the Larchmont Country Club's private dining room, the same room where Priya's reception had taken place 3 months earlier. My father liked symmetry. He thought it made him look magnanimous, welcoming his prodigal son back into the fold in the very place he'd humiliated him. There were 14 people in that room. My parents, Thomas, Craig Doyle, 4 other board members, 2 foundation staff, Denise, my aunt and uncle, and me. I wore my actual suit this time, the $3,000 one, tailored, the one that fit like it belonged to a man who owned a $47 million company, because it did. My father stood to make a toast before the formal acceptance of my donation. He raised his glass and said, "To family, to second chances, and to those who finally understand where they belong." I raised my water glass along with everyone else. Then I set it down. "Before we accept the donation," I said, my voice even, quiet, the same volume I use closing a supply contract, "I'd like to ask a few questions about the foundation's finances, just for my own understanding." Craig Doyle smiled, the practiced smile of a man who deflected questions like this 100 times. "Of course, Michael. Nonprofit accounting can look complicated from the outside." "It can," I agreed. "For instance, I noticed Meridian Health Consulting received $2.1 million in loans from this foundation over 3 years, and that Meridian's registered address is a P.O. box in Georgetown, Cayman Islands. I noticed the same three names, Richard Ferris, Elaine Ferris, and Craig Doyle, listed as its sole officers. And I noticed those loans were never repaid, and were instead reclassified last fiscal year as consulting fee settlements. The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when air conditioning becomes suddenly, unbearably loud. My father's face didn't move, but his knuckles went white around his glass. That is a gross mischaracterization of a legitimate advisory arrangement. Maybe, I said. I brought the filings if anyone would like to look. I opened the folder and slid copies down the table, to the board members, to my aunt, to Craig Doyle, whose hand visibly shook taking his. I also have something else, I said, and I pressed a button on my phone. Denise's recording from 3 weeks prior filled the room. My mother's voice, tinny but unmistakable. Do you think he actually believed that nonsense about donor cultivation events? My father's laugh. Thomas's voice. As long as he doesn't ask about the Cayman transfer, we're fine. Nobody in that room breathed. I asked about the Cayman transfer, I said. So here we are. My father stood, his chair scraping back hard enough to catch on the carpet. You have no right. I have every right, I said, still not raising my voice. I'm a donor of record as of this morning, with standing to audit fund usage for 90 days under the services agreement. My $250,000 was wired through. I also had my attorney file a report with the Massachusetts Attorney General's Nonprofit Organizations/Public Charities Division at 9 a.m. this morning, and a parallel complaint with the IRS Tax-Exempt and Government Entities Division regarding potential private inurement and self-dealing under Section 4941. This isn't a family disagreement anymore. It's a filed matter. That was when two men in plain clothes, who had been quietly seated near the door since before the toast, stood and identified themselves as investigators from the Attorney General's office, present at my legal team's request to observe and, if warranted, execute a records preservation notice on the Foundation's files effective immediately. My mother reached for her water glass and knocked it over instead. The water spread across the white tablecloth, soaking the corner of the evidence folder Craig Doyle had dropped in his lap. I picked up the empty champagne flute in front of my place setting, the one meant to toast my generous return to the family, and set it down deliberately on its side, letting it roll off the table and shatter on the floor. To family, I said quietly, echoing my father's toast from 3 months earlier. To second chances. And to finally understanding where things belong. Over the following 4 months, the consequences arrived the way consequences always do once the first domino falls. Quietly, then all at once. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into the Ferris Family Foundation for breach of fiduciary duty and misuse of charitable assets. Within 6 weeks, the foundation's board voted, under legal pressure, to remove my father, my mother, and Craig Doyle from all officer positions. The IRS revoked the foundation's tax-exempt status pending review, a process that typically takes 18 months, but which effectively ended the organization's ability to solicit donations overnight. Craig Doyle was the first to fold. Facing personal liability exposure north of $2 million, he agreed to a settlement with the Attorney General's office, personally repaying $840,000 and accepting a permanent ban from serving as an officer or director of any nonprofit registered in Massachusetts. He resigned from the country club the same week, and according to Denise, moved to Florida within the month. My brother Thomas was placed on administrative leave from Boston Memorial pending an internal ethics review, not for the foundation directly, but because the hospital's compliance office discovered he'd used foundation funds to cover $60,000 in personal expenses, including a family vacation to Portugal that he had, in an email later produced in Discovery, described as a team-building CME trip. My father faced the steepest fall. Boston Memorial's board, unwilling to be associated with an active state fraud investigation, quietly negotiated his early retirement, 31 years, ended not with a plaque but with a press release that didn't mention his name after the second paragraph. His medical license remains active, but 3 of his 4 hospital privileges have not been renewed. My mother resigned from the hospital's internal medicine department the same week the story broke in the Boston Globe's Metro section, under the headline Prominent Medical Families Charity Investigated for Alleged Self-Dealing. She has not spoken to me since the board meeting, except through her attorney. Not everyone fell, and I made sure of that on purpose. Denise, who'd worn the recording pin and risked her own standing in the family to help me, I brought onto Ferris Health System's board as a compliance advisor, at a salary considerably higher than the $9,200 the foundation had ever managed to give a single scholarship student. The 4 first-generation medical students who were supposed to receive scholarships that year and received nothing. I found them. Through a scholarship fund I set up independently, the Ferris Alvarez Access Fund, named for my company's head of operations rather than my own family. I fully funded all 4 of their remaining years of tuition, no strings, no press release, no mention of my last name if they didn't want it. The foundation's 2 remaining junior staff members, an administrative assistant and a grants coordinator, neither of whom had any knowledge of the Cayman arrangement, I helped place at a legitimate regional nonprofit through a contact of mine, so that 2 people with no part in this mess didn't lose their jobs over other people's greed. It was a Tuesday in November, raining hard, when my father showed up at my door. I almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight in a way that didn't look healthy, wearing a coat that had clearly been expensive once but hadn't been cleaned in a while. He stood on my porch without an umbrella, water running off his collar, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "Michael," he said finally, "I need to talk to you."